More deaths as the northern Caucasus descends into increasing violence. But what are the root causes? Separatist sentiments or disenchantment with the governing regimes? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Imran Garda. Violence in former Soviet states in the Caucasus region appears to be on the rise. This week, a suicide bomber hit a police station in Ingushetia. 20 people were killed and more than 130 injured in the attack in Ingushetia's main city, Nazran. The injured included many children from a nearby apartment block. The bomber reportedly drove his car full of explosives into the police compound before detonating his device. Ingushetia's leader has blamed militants for the attack. Russian President Dmitry Medvedev has sacked the region's interior minister. He said the attack could have been prevented. But this is not an isolated incident. Russia's North Caucasus has been plagued by violence in recent months. About a week ago, Ingushetia's construction minister, Ruslan Amirkhanov, was assassinated in his office by masked gunmen. In a separate incident, 3 employees of Russia's emergency ministry were shot dead. In late July, a suicide bomber killed 6 people and wounded at least 10 others in the capital of Chechnya. Earlier in that month, 9 officers were killed when militants firing machine guns and grenades ambushed a police convoy. In June, Ingush President Yunusbek Yevkurov was severely wounded when a suicide bomber attacked his motorcade. And joining us today are our guests in Moscow, Masha Lipman, editor of the Pro et Contra journal, published by Carnegie Moscow Center. In Tbilisi, Zaza Gachecheladze, editor-in-chief of the Georgian newspaper The Messenger. And in London, Natalia Leshchenko, Russia and Eurasia analyst at Global Insight. Thank you, all of you, for joining us. Let's start off with Natalia Leshchenko. Natalia, is the Republic in full-blown civil war at this moment in time?
It would be too wrong to call this a civil war. It's certainly a problem with insurgency. It's certainly a very severe security situation, but you don't have 2 hostile parties facing each other and trying to eliminate the other. So I wouldn't call it a civil war.
Okay, in trying to find out what's driving all of this, what would you say is the main reason for the violence?
Well, you can have 2 perspectives on this. One is the short-term one, in which you would say, and probably agree with the current president of Ingushetia, who said that the militias, the local militias, have responded to the crackdown by the official forces, by the police. And so that's like a culmination before actually the situation calms down. But if you look in a very long-term perspective, Russia has been trying to get hand of the Caucasus for a couple of centuries now, and they could never get it right.
Masha Lipman, would you agree with that?
Mostly, yes. I would say 2 main factors are involved here. One is that objectively, North Caucasus is an extremely difficult challenge for Russia. This is a poor region. This is a region with very high unemployment. This is a region which consists of 6 administrative units called republics, and none of the 6 economies is viable. All of them rely heavily or mostly on allocations from Moscow. But on top of being a difficult problem and on top of being culturally very different from the rest of Russia, being more traditional, way less modern than Russia is, I think another factor on top of this is Russia's policies. Russia has heavily relied on loyal leaders to take care and to handle the problems there, and looked the other way at the methods those leaders were using. And mostly the methods used were heavy-handed, were brutal, thus breeding resistance.
Would you, sorry to interrupt you, would you go so far as to say that leaders like Yunusbek Yevkurov are seen as puppets by their own people?
Yevkurov is a separate case. Actually, Ingushetia is an interesting example because many years ago it had a leader who was regarded as a blessing for his people, was deeply respected and even worshipped by his people, which actually made President Putin, who was president at the time, wary because he drew his legitimacy from public popularity, which made him too independent to the Kremlin's taste. He was replaced by another person who was totally loyal to the Kremlin but fully incompetent, and it was under his guidance that the place became a cesspool of violence. Yevkurov has just been appointed. He was a replacement for the incompetent previous leader, and he only just started. Experts of the region say that actually his first attempts were at least thorough. At least he wanted to do good to his people, but his attempts were cut short very soon after his start. His life was attempted, and he nearly was killed in this terrorist attack.
Natalia Lishchenko, just to try and make something absolutely clear, the people don't necessarily want to secede from Russia, do they? Particularly in Ingushetia.
Exactly, that's the main point of difference with Chechnya here. Actually, Yevkurov is highly respected. The current president is highly respected within the country because he's an Ingush himself. He's from there. He understands the local people, and he seems to genuinely care about the situation and try to get things right. He has only been in the place for a year, as we mentioned, and the whole fact that an assassination attempt was done on him actually suggests that he started making a difference in the country. So in that sense, he's no puppet of Kremlin in the terms of being someone completely sort of disengaged from the population. This is not the case at the moment.
Okay, let's take that. Sorry to interrupt
what was
you.
The other question?
Let's take that point and put it to Zazagachi Chilat. Say that Yevkurov is in no way a puppet of the Kremlin, and the fact that they tried to kill him was actually because he was making a difference.
Well, actually, could I go a little bit in the background of the event? Because when a patient has severe pain, he's not only treated with painkiller, but he should be examined very thoroughly, and it should be identified what is the cause and what are the reasons of such developments. When I say that, I mean that it's not only the personalities and likes and dislikes of some simple, ordinary people of Ingushetia, whether they like the minister or the president or someone, but it's much deeper, I guess. I suppose that it all is connected with the general policy Russia is conducting since the collapse of the Soviet Union by encouraging separatism in the neighboring country, Georgia, and inspiring it and supporting it and promoting it. In reality, Russia backfired itself. And this is the results of such developments, that Russia, in fact, encouraging separatism in Georgia undermined its own policy, because, in fact, Northern Caucasus has always been the weak point of Russian policy in the Caucasus. And this is now awoken, and these are the results which Russia itself promoted by encouraging separatism in Georgia.
Okay, let's put this to Masha. I'd like to bring in Masha Lipman before we come back to Natalia. Masha, is that a fair point, that Russia is contradictory because it encourages separatism elsewhere, for example in Georgia, but it crushes dissent within its own republics, like in Ingushetia or Chechnya?
Well, I would say separatism is not an issue here. In fact, or if it is, it's a minor factor. In fact, none of the 6 republics today is seeking a secession. Even in Chechnya, people do not seek to secede, and not least because they heavily rely on Moscow for money. the bulk of their budgets comes from the federal center. So without the allocations from Moscow, they would not be viable. So secessionists may be partly the problem in Chechnya, but certainly not elsewhere. We are facing here a combination of different reasons for people to get violent. There may be clannish problems, there may be blood feuds, there may be people distressed and desperate because their relatives fell victim of police brutality. There may be indeed radical religious extremists. There may be any number of people with their various grievances and various goals. The point of the matter is
you're mentioning all these reasons. Let's try and say, boil this down to maybe 3 core issues: poverty, radical Islamism, and heavy-handedness of the security forces. Out of those 3, which one would you say is the chief driving force for this unrest in Ingushetia?
Well, I would say in Ingushetia it has become a vicious circle of the heavy-handed operation of the government and police officials antagonizing the people. People take revenge and punitive measures follow, and this vicious circle of violence continues. So I would say police brutality and incompetence of the local government is the chief reason in Ingushetia, even though other problems also exist.
Natalia Leshenko, you want to come in there?
Yes, I would say that there are actually 2 kinds of separatism, or if you want, we can name these as 2 main problems. One is the cultural difference, which we have talked about, and another rather are the opportunities for organized crime. There are still economic opportunities in those countries, and that was the driving force behind the Chechen mobilization, one can argue, in the 1990s. And here you have a similar situation in this in the conditions when the federal forces they can be seen as brutal, but at the same time they can be seen as weak because they cannot handle the situation. This context creates a very prolific ground for organized crime, and it's actually the paramilitaries belonging to these groups seek sometimes independence, or they take up the slogans of separatism without it actually having sort of any proper grounds or popular following. So I would say it's cultural difference and organized crime.
Zaza Gachicheladze, both the other guests are saying that separatism isn't too much of an issue here, or secession as such, from Russia. I mean, looking at the facts, 90% of Ingushetia's revenue comes from Moscow. It can't really do without Moscow, can it?
Yes, but it's very difficult to believe that person only takes as major motivation some economic issues and goes and kills 20 policemen or attacks president or any high official of the country, of the republic, and these are only reasons. It's very difficult to agree with such argument. So I still think that there is major argument, which is the separatism motivations and moods in the population, in Chechnya in particular, and in Ingushetia, which has been starting right now, and which is the major, I should say, motivation.
Well, let's try and look a bit deeper into the background now, just for a little bit. Since the fall of the USSR, Russia has retained a large amount of control over those former satellite states. Many have Kremlin-backed leaders, and their economies often rely on trade from Russia. But not all of these states are happy about Russia's ongoing influence. Separatists in Chechnya forced Russian troops out in the mid-1990s and gained de facto independence. But Russia did not relinquish control, and fighting has continued ever since. Chechnya's president is strongly supported by Moscow and has been accused of human rights violations. Last year, Russia went to war with another former Soviet state, Georgia, over the breakaway republics of South Ossetia and Abkhazia. The 2 smaller territories had been partly under Russian control, and when Georgia attempted to wrest control back, Russia violently intervened. Now it seems anti-Russian violence has spilled over into Ingushetia. Well, our guests are still with us. Let's bring in Masha Lipman. Masha, with Ingushetia at this moment in time, do you expect Moscow to respond like that proverbial wounded bear? Is it iron fist time?
Well, I hope not, and I don't think the Kremlin actually is yearning for waging war once again in North Caucasus. I think the Kremlin opted for this policy that in the case of Chechnya was called Chechenization, and in fact this is a policy that Russia has pursued all over in North Caucasus, in all the 6 republics, relying on a loyal leader and looking the other way, being reluctant to look deep into the problem that Natalia mentioned, that I fully agree with, the problem of corruption, which breeds crime, and the problem of cultural differences and a different cultural and religious environment over there, not least something that we haven't touched upon. These are the regions with scores of ethnic groups, and the relations between the ethnic groups being tense or sometimes hostile, and Russia was unwilling and reluctant to deal with the problems thoroughly, instead relying on those rulers, looking the other way at the embezzled funds and at the corruption and at how exactly they manage their territories. So from a situation in which Russia actually hoped to get away with just delivering funds and appointing loyal leaders, to getting deeply involved in the region once again militarily, I don't think this is what Russia seeks. I think Russia would want to avoid that. The question is whether Russia would actually be able to pursue the same policy for much longer without seeing its first goal not to be fulfilled. And the first goal was, of course, to contain the violence within North Caucasus so that terrorism activity and subversive acts would not spill over to Russia at large.
Natalia Lyshenko, Human Rights Watch accused Russian federal forces of, quote, dirty war tactics and Chechnya-style operations in Ingushetia, including torture of suspects, kidnapping of journalists, and suppression of political opposition. Is that a fairly accurate portrayal of what's going on in Ingushetia?
I think it would be difficult to comment very correctly on the reports because I personally haven't been there, and comparing to what we hear, we can certainly allow for a fair degree of police brutality. After all, in Russia methods can be fairly rough, but I think it would be fair to say that Kremlin is not interested in making Ingushetia or the neighboring countries, for that matter, a sort of an empty field. They do want security there, and they actually do want economic prosperity for those regions so that they stop being a hotbed of problems for them and for Moscow and the constant source of embarrassment. It's just, so it's not an ethnic issue. There's a major ethnic misunderstanding, but it's not that it's some kind of an ethnic conflict between Russians and the others. And in Ingushetia, this has been seen very clearly. There has not been any major rivalry between the Russian ethnic groups and the Ingushetian ethnic groups. So here we have an attempt to put the situation under control, and most importantly the economic situation under control, and Russia is being very awkward, as it often is. Let's
bring in JAzeera in Tbilisi. JAzeera, Natalia says that the Kremlin wants security and economic prosperity for Ingushetia. What do you think?
Well, you know, the grudge against Soviet Union, particularly in Ingushetia, comes from the 1944, when almost all the Ingush nation was deported from the territory it is occupying now to Kazakhstan and other Siberian places. And only in the mid-50s they were returned. So the dissatisfaction and discontent is here. And I would agree that there are some minor issues like economic issues, cultural differences, and so on. But major thing is the Russian attempt to subordinate and suppress any kind of national identity appearance in the North Caucasus.
Okay, let's ask Masha Lipman about that. Masha Lipman, is there this concerted Russian attempt to suppress the identity, to destroy the identity of the people?
No, I think, in fact, there is not enough care, cultural care included, from the part of Russia. Actually, Russia looks the other way. Russia looks at those territories actually increasingly demodernizing and slipping back into traditional ways and traditional law, into defiance of the laws and constitution of Russia. It is not about Russifying these places. In fact, exactly the opposite is true. Because Russia ignores the needs of the people. I want to point out to your previous question to Natalia, it is not the Russian military that brutalized the people in Ingushetia. It is the Ingush police, and this is part of the same issue, of the same Russian policy. Russia wants it to be the problem of the Ingush government, not of the Russian government, so as not to antagonize the people there against Russia, not to breed anti-Russian sentiments, and thereby to keep Russia secure, or to keep the fragile security of Russia, so as we do not have major terrorist attacks in the Russian territory.
Okay, before we wrap this up, Natalia, I want to bring in the religious angle here. I was going through one of the websites, one of the more extreme websites, the Caucasus website, English language. It mainly shows its support of Chechnyan militants. It refers to the Ingush dead in this recent attack as apostates, the suicide attackers as martyrs, the Russians as infidels. How much support do you think this sort of ideology has amongst the Ingush people?
This depends really also. I would also bring it down to some economic rationale as well. The degree of sort of the rise of the radical Islamist forces, not only in the North Caucasus but also in Central Asia, is very often directly proportional to the degree of the economic duress people have to suffer. So although it is obvious to say that the suicide bombing tactic is very often linked to radical Islamism, this is not something that would be the only reason. I would say religion is important, but it shouldn't be overplayed. I think it should be considered together with other factors such as the ethnicity, history, culture, so the whole bundle of things to make proper sense of it.
JAzeera Gachicheladze, as a final thought, do you think that Russia has overplayed the religious aspect, which has suited its purposes?
Well, I believe that radical Islamism is one of the tools which is used by the separatism leaders of Chechnya and Ingushetia, and it is just manipulated. So this is my approach.
Final comment from Marsha Lipman. Marsha, we're running out of time. 30 seconds, please.
Right. I think the factor of radical Islam exists. It's not major, but it is overplayed by the local leaders, and this is the reason why they brutalize the people. They are so afraid of potential attacks by radical Islamists that they persecute those even vaguely suspected of ties with radical Islam, and this breeds revenge on the part of the population and the part of the relatives of the victims of police brutality.
Marsha Lipman, JAzeera Gachicheladze, and Natalia Leshchenko, thank you very much for joining us here for this discussion. And thank you so much, the viewer, for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. As always, we welcome your comments, your suggestions, and your questions. You can email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Bye-bye.